Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today to the Global Young Leaders Initiative Global Youth Summit on Near-Term Climate Risk and Climate Intervention. Can we keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive? My name is Madeline Carlsberg Schaefer, but you can just call me Maddie. I'm from Scotland, but I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm the host for today. I am the lead of GYLI, the Global Young Leaders Initiative, since its inception 3 years ago. Today, I'm joined by two brilliant co-moderators, Joshua Mponsum and Ricardo Pineda Guzman. Ricardo is the director and co-founder of Sustenta Honduras. He's also an international strategy fellow with SilverLining. SilverLining is, of course, the organization under which GYLI operates. And we also have Josh Mponsum with us to take us through some of the sessions. He's the executive director and founder of Green Africa Youth Organization. And he is soon to be the co-director for strategy for the new Youth Climate Justice Fund. So congratulations, Josh, on that. So yeah, it is a real pleasure to have so many of you from all over the world, truly like a global and diverse participant list today to talk about a newer and emerging topic, a rapidly emerging topic at that, which is climate intervention. So today, our intention is to facilitate a space where young people can engage on this topic meaningfully with experts, with other youth. Because ultimately we do face the grim reality that even with rapid emissions reductions, we have climate impacts now and near-term climate impacts with lives and livelihoods great at risk. And we're running out of options to mitigate temperature rise to the advised 1.5 degrees as the IPCC has advised. So with that, I want to start with a word cloud, just to get the brain juices flowing, just to gauge, what comes to mind when you think of keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and we'll compare your responses now to what to the end of the summit after we've gone through climate intervention, research, governance, youth perspectives, etc. So please do share your reflections to keeping 1.5 degrees alive. What words or phrases do you think of? So we've got urgent and crucial, most definitely. Tipping points, very valid point. Keeping 1.5 degrees alive, it's not just an arbitrary number, it's also important with respect to key ways the climate system operates, preventing irreversible changes. Unfeasible, a dream. We've also got impossible. Yeah, okay. Loss and damage. Okay, interesting. We've got possible. I like that. I like the ambition. Huge emissions cuts, that's for certain. Far away. Okay, this is great. I'll leave this up for, let's get another 10 seconds in before we move on, and I will capture this and we'll be able to compare it to our thoughts at the end of the summit today. Okay, vulnerability, necessary, nice. Okay, thanks everyone, that's great. So yeah, now we've got that in mind, I wanted to highlight, 3 years ago when GYLI was set up, when this initiative was set up, I set out on a search for other young people in the climate space to engage on the topic of climate intervention. And at the time, you could barely find anyone who had heard of the topic. So it's, to me, quite astonishing to see so many of you here with us today. 61 participants. That is the biggest I've ever seen among youth joining together on a topic like this. And it's a clear example, I think, of the power and leadership and energy of young people in climate action. So thank you again for joining us. Today we have 3 sessions covering research governance and youth action, all with expert younger and older generation speakers. Big thank you to them for joining us. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ricardo for the first session. Yeah, Ricardo, on to session 1, which is an introduction to solar climate intervention. Thanks.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you for hosting this. And of course, thanks to everyone who might be either waking up early, just as me, or perhaps going already in the middle of the day. Really, really happy to be here in this space and to have the opportunity to bring some of the most distinguished scientific leaders when it comes to climate intervention. Then before we get right into the topic, I just want to really recognize the importance of GYLI and the importance that we do have this new initiative that already has some years going, but that also brings a space for youth to engage meaningfully, for youth to build capacities, and also for youth from the global south, like myself, to be included and to be a part of the conversation. So just as of now, I wanted to remind everyone that we're going to have a Q&A session right before each of the sessions. And for that, I would appreciate if we could all be participative and be sure to use the space the best as possible to try to gain the knowledge and to try to use in the end the space as best as possible. Now, enough talking about myself. I really think that we have a great session to kick off this summit, and this is the introduction to solar climate intervention by 2 of the most distinguished and renowned scientific leaders in the field. For this, I wanted to introduce both Jim Hurrell and Sarah Doherty. Jim Hurrell is Professor and Scott Presidential Chair in Environmental Science and Engineering at the Colorado State University. He is a member of the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program on the World Meteorological Organization, and was a lead author on the recent UN Environmental Program report on solar climate intervention, which I really recommend everyone to read it if you haven't, by the way. He was formerly the director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, as well as Atmospheric Science Division President for the American Geophysical Union. Jim, it's an honor to have you here. I also wanted to introduce Sarah Doherty, who Sarah is a senior research scientist and marine cloud brightening project program manager and a project affiliate associate professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences of the University of Washington at the United States, which is distinguished as one of the best atmospheric science universities in the world. She is also a leading author of the scientific assessment of the ozone layer depletion for the Montreal Protocol. So again, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. Jim, I wanted to kick you off with an opportunity to speak about an introduction on solar climate interventions.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo, and welcome to everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm really excited and I'm honored to have been asked to discuss this topic of climate intervention with all of you. And in particular, one specific form of climate intervention that would reflect a very small amount of sunlight away from the planet in order to limit or stop future temperature increases. And as has already been articulated in some of the introductory comments, this is a very important topic because carbon dioxide emissions continue to increase in the atmosphere. Right now, we're emitting something close to 40 gigatons of CO2 each year, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels. And this relentless continuing increase is causing the planet to warm up at a very rapid rate. And I'm sure most of you or all of you have seen graphs like this before. This is a plot that shows changes in average surface temperatures averaged across the globe and for each year from 1880 through 2021, where the temperatures that are plotted here are changes or departures from the average temperature over a 30-year period from 1951 to 1980. And what you can see is that the global average surface temperature has increased about 1.2 degrees Celsius over this period of time. The warmest years on record have all occurred since 2015, and each decade since 1980 has been warmer than the previous decade. And I think as this audience truly appreciates, every fraction of a degree of increase in global average temperature really increases the negative impact and the damage that will be done as a result of climate change. This image is a summary of the impacts and risks across a wide range of natural, managed, and human systems relative to increasing levels of global temperature, indicated by moving up the vertical axis. And I want to point your attention, first of all, to the gray bar that extends horizontally across the plot. That indicates the amount of warming that had occurred over the period 2006 through 2015. We're already a decade beyond that. And the changes in colors from yellow to red to purple indicate more severe impacts. You can clearly see that even slight increases in temperature over the coming decades will have increasingly harmful effects on many systems. Also noted by the solid red line is the amount of warming that both world leaders and scientists around the globe have stressed that we must not exceed. As Maddie mentioned, this 1.5 degrees of warming relative to pre-industrial temperatures, if we are to avoid unleashing far more severe climate change impacts, such as more frequent and severe droughts and heat waves and extreme rainfall events, with truly devastating impacts on ecosystems and people. However, the reality is that at present, we're headed toward a world that even if all the countries do what they've pledged to do, we will probably experience about 3 degrees or so of warming by the end of the century, almost 3 times what we've experienced today, unless we become much more aggressive and quicker in reducing greenhouse gas emissions by moving toward carbon-free energy systems. And even if we do that, an important point is the amount of greenhouse gases that we have already put into the atmosphere, coupled with the fact that the oceans will retain the extra heat they've already gained for many decades into the future, means that continued climate warming is virtually certain to occur for the next several decades. Indeed, we will likely move beyond this 1.5 degrees of warming in the next 10 years or so. So this has led to really a growing need to explore additional response strategies. What tools do we have in our toolbox to combat climate change? Now, what we have to do is we have to reduce emissions. We have to do climate adaptation. We have to do large-scale carbon removal. And all of this could possibly lead to enhanced safety for human and natural systems by limiting any additional warming of the planet. But since we're committed to this additional warming over the coming decades, we're also thinking about things like solar climate intervention. And the topic of solar climate intervention and the form that I'm going to talk about today is motivated by what we see in nature after some volcanic eruptions, and that is the dispersal of very small reflective particles high into the atmosphere that reflect some sunlight back out to space. What you're looking at here is a photo from space of the atmosphere after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991. And what we observe after these types of volcanic eruptions is a cooling of the planet for 1 to 2 years after such eruptions, because these tiny particles, which are known as aerosols, reflect a very small amount of sunlight away from the planet, causing the planet to cool. So this leads to the possibility that perhaps we could mimic this effect deliberately. We could deliberately modify the Earth's climate through the reflection of a portion of the incoming solar radiation in order to stabilize the temperatures, prevent further warming, and therefore reduce some of the risks to manage in natural ecosystems and to people from global warming. What you see in this diagram is several different proposed solar climate intervention techniques. Sarah Doherty is going to speak after me about increasing sunlight reflection by brightening clouds over marine areas. What I want to focus on for the rest of this talk is something that is known as stratospheric aerosol injection. And again, it is sort of mimicking the effect of a volcanic eruption through the dispersal, the intentional dispersal of sulfate or calcium carbonate or some other material into the stratosphere that would reflect a small amount of solar radiation away from the planet. And this is sort of a picture that puts all of these approaches together. We have to reduce emissions. We have to get off this high emission trajectory and begin to bend the curve downward by reducing emissions. That is the only solution to climate change. We have to adopt approaches to actively remove carbon from the system. That's generally referred to as carbon dioxide removal. But even then, as I've articulated, we're likely to go above this 1.5 degrees of warming. So until carbon levels reach safer levels in the atmosphere, perhaps we could do something like stratospheric aerosol injection to avoid this so-called temperature overshoot and keep global temperatures at safer levels, evolve relative to the climate change world on the left. And you see that the world is much cooler and we can actually keep global mean temperatures near 2020 values. So while this appears very promising, there are many unanswered questions, and this is why it's so critical to do research on this topic to inform policy. So what are the best materials to use for this application? What would the regional impacts of doing this be? We can cool down the planet, but how might things like rainfall change regionally, or how might ecosystems be impacted? And are there ways to do stratospheric aerosol injection that would minimize any potential harms? And of course, there are very significant political, perhaps ethical, and governance uncertainties as well. Who would get to control the global thermostat? Nevertheless, if we want to try to keep global temperatures at well below 2 degrees warming, as is mentioned in the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to do the research. We need to understand the benefits and the risks of solar climate intervention relative to the risks that we know are going to be caused by climate change. And so there's increasing calls for research. This is one example. This is a US National Academy of Sciences report that came out a couple of years ago that talks about how the US, in coordination with other countries, must really put into place a rigorous research program on this topic. Other professional societies, such as the American Meteorological Society, have also recommended an accelerated and robust climate intervention research program. And then Ricardo had mentioned this United Nations Environmental Program report that came out just a few months ago that makes very similar recommendations, and that now is the time to do research on this topic. So that is my brief introduction to solar climate intervention, and in particular stratospheric aerosol injection. And I really appreciate everyone who is here, and thank you for your time and attention. And I look forward to taking some questions later on. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm sure there'll be many questions. Now I wanted to give the space for Sarah, who will give us a high-level overview of marine cloud brightening technologies.
Thank you. So Jim just talked about stratospheric aerosol injection, where sunlight reflection would be increased through increasing the scattering of sunlight off of particles, or what we also refer to as aerosols. And with marine cloud brightening, the idea would be to increase sunlight reflection by clouds, and specifically by clouds in certain areas over the ocean. The basic principle behind marine cloud brightening is that by adding particles to clouds, the water in the cloud gets distributed over a larger number of droplets. So everything else being the same, which is an important caveat I'll get back to later, a cloud with a lot of small droplets is more reflective than a cloud with large droplets because there's more surface area of water in that cloud. And a really visible manifestation of this effect can be seen in what we call ship tracks. So this is a satellite image off the west coast of North America. And you can see these bright streaks in these low marine clouds. And these are caused by particles from the engines of cargo ships mixing into the clouds, causing them to get brighter through the process that I just described. And it was actually seeing ship track images like this that prompted the idea that it might be possible to do this intentionally to reduce climate warming. But instead of doing it by adding pollution particles to clouds, the idea would be to add sea salt to clouds. So while ship tracks are a really visible manifestation of how adding aerosols or particles to clouds can make them brighter, the emissions of particulate pollution in general through human activities is making clouds brighter over really broad regions of the globe. It's not as visibly obvious as the ship tracks, but it's happening over very broad regions. So this bar graph is showing human contributions to climate change. And the red bars are, you can see warming from greenhouse gases on the left. And then in the middle is something you don't hear about as much, which is a cooling effect of particulate pollution. And there's two bars, the direct effect, one labeled the direct effect, which is the direct scattering of sunlight by particles, similar to what Jim talked about, you'd be using for stratospheric aerosol injection. And then the larger blue bar is how human particulate emissions are currently increasing sunlight reflection from clouds. So this process, these aerosols or particles in the atmosphere already are offsetting about 0.5 to 1 degree C of warming from greenhouse gases. And so this is something we're already doing to the atmosphere, but with stratospheric climate, solar climate intervention, what we're talking about is leveraging these effects in a way that's cleaner to try and offset climate warming. So what if society decided that we wanted to intentionally reduce climate warming through marine cloud brightening? So estimates are that it would take some thousands or tens of thousands of autonomous ships in specific areas of the ocean, each spraying about 10 to the 16th sea salt particles per second into specific regions of marine clouds. And that by doing that, you could offset a large fraction of projected warming from greenhouse gases. But this is really just a first order estimate. And there are really important questions that still need to be answered to know if we can actually predictably and reliably brighten clouds sufficiently to cool climate. So I showed you this effect by which marine cloud brightening sort of nominally operates, but it turns out that clouds actually respond to clouds, to the addition of particles in a very complex set of ways. Adding aerosols to clouds does generally make them have more small droplets, but this can have knock-on effects that can lead to either amplifying or reducing the initial brightening, and possibly could even lead to cloud dimming, which is the opposite of what you want. So as you can imagine, if you have more small droplets, that could suppress the precipitation. So if you suppress precipitation, the cloud lasts longer, you have even more sunlight reflection increase. But the other thing that can happen is that the droplets are smaller, so they evaporate more easily. And this could lead to a decrease in cloud liquid water amount. And that would produce potentially cloud dimming. So there's a whole bunch of sort of knock-on effects like this that occur in clouds when you make them have more small droplets. And it's understanding all these responses and how they play out under different conditions that's a really critical question to addressing the feasibility of marine cloud brightening for a cooling climate. So a lot of the work that we're doing to study the feasibility of marine cloud brightening involves understanding these and other cloud responses under the big range of conditions that we actually find in the atmosphere, because how they play out depends very strongly on the meteorological conditions and the background particulate conditions. And a lot of this work that we're doing is using high resolution models that can simulate the detailed responses of clouds when you add aerosols to them. So this is an animation from one of those simulations. The top panel is showing a 3D rendering of the clouds with some rain streaks coming out of the bottom of them. And the colors from blue to yellow, mostly in green, are showing particulate concentrations in a simulation of adding aerosols to clouds. And the bottom panel shows how the cloud reflectivity changes in the area where those particles have been added. And you can see that in this case, the clouds get brighter. But the point is, we're doing a whole lot of simulations like this to try and study cloud responses under different conditions. And these are very complex, detailed models, but they are just models. So we really need to check and see if these models are accurate. So another part of the work that we're hoping to do is to actually do observations of cloud responses in the real marine environment using a sea salt spray system, a cloud aerosol research tool to study how clouds respond at these very small scales. And I think this work is really critical. It's something that hasn't happened yet, but it's really critical to understanding how clouds actually will respond in the real environment, testing those high resolution models and improving those high resolution models. And that in turn is critical to understanding how climate would respond to marine cloud brightening. We can use those high resolution simulations and models to basically inform the global models and do better global model simulations. And that's critical to answering the second big question, which is if we increase sunlight reflection in regions amenable to marine cloud brightening, how will it affect climate and climate impacts? So this is just showing sort of 3 of the regions circled in black that would be, we expect would be amenable to marine cloud brightening. And if this simulation shows if you implemented in a model, a global model, if you implemented marine cloud brightening, what temperature change would you get? And you can see that you get cooling over the entire globe. It's not uniform, and neither would the changes in precipitation and other responses that are important. So just like with stratospheric aerosol injection, there's a huge amount of work to be done to understand if you implemented marine cloud brightening using different approaches, implementing it in different regions by different amounts, how would that play out in the climate system and affect climate impacts? So that's the other area of work that's really critically needed, is to do a lot of global modeling studies where those global models are informed and improved by the higher resolution modeling studies, which in turn are tested through field studies of how clouds actually respond in the real environment using a cloud aerosol research instrument. So that's a very quick hit on the scope of work that's needed for marine cloud brightening and some of the key questions that we're trying to address currently in the research community.
Thank you, Sarah and Jim. I always say that I feel better after listening to climate scientists, because I feel like our world is definitely in some good hands. And at least as climate activists, it's always something that I always like and cherish when I connect with. And so I want to invite everyone to pop in questions in the Q&A, and please feel free to. Well, we will also have an intergenerational dialogue where we will be able to get into much more detail in the questions. But again, please, for all the participants, I invite you to start asking some questions. Now, just to start with something that I've always had in mind and that I would like to know more for both stratospheric aerosol injection as well as marine cloud brightening is, how would you perform these experiments? Like, could you tell us a little bit more about how the research would be optimally performed? And yeah, I guess we can start perhaps with Jim.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. And I think maybe on some of the observational experiments, I'll let Sarah answer that, because I know she's thinking very deeply about that. What my research really entails is, as we've seen in both presentations, our modeling systems are really key toward trying to understand the potential impacts of these approaches relative to the impacts that we're going to see in response to climate change. I think it's very important that this research always be framed in the context of the relative benefits and risks relative to what's going to occur as a result of climate change. So I use the exact same models that are assessed, for instance, by world scientists and then written up and summarized in publications like the IPCC reports These are the exact same climate models that we use to project future changes in climate. They're not perfect, as Sarah said. Models are imperfect representations of the real world, but yet if they're used intelligently, you can learn a lot of information about the likely changes that we're going to be experiencing. So using those exact same models that have really guided a lot of our understanding, as well as some policy decisions around the future of climate change, we perform experiments with those models to kind of answer the what if questions. What if we were to inject stratospheric aerosols in certain amounts in certain regions of the globe? What would those impacts be? And those impacts on weather and climate, of course, but also on things like ecosystems, terrestrial and marine ecosystems, human health. I saw in the Wordle diagram that Maddie started with things about tipping points. So sort of irreversible changes in the climate system. How might stratospheric aerosol injection slow some of that down? So I'm primarily a modeler, and I use models to answer these questions.
It's true. Interesting, Jim. Thank you. Now over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so sort of similar to what Jim said, my work in this area was a pretty natural segue from doing research on how particulate pollution is already affecting climate, both through direct scattering of sunlight and also affecting clouds. And so the field work that we need to do to study marine cloud brightening is just really, really similar to the field work that the field studies that we've already been doing to understand how particulate pollution is affecting clouds and climate. So the type of field studies we would do would be really modeled after those studies that have been done tens of times, where we take, aircraft and instruments and we measure things in the clouds at a sort of a smaller scale to understand the key processes going on in those clouds in response to the particles. The only thing that would be different here is that we would be using a new cloud aerosol research instrument that would allow us to control the sea salt particles being added to the clouds. And that could be really critical, actually, as somebody who wants to understand how clouds in general respond to the addition of particles from pollution, as well as for marine cloud brightening. The idea of being able to do studies where we're actually controlling the aerosol perturbation to the cloud is kind of exciting, even outside of MCB research, just for understanding cloud responses to aerosols in general. So that would all be done at a very small scale, process level scale, to improve these high resolution models, which would then inform the global models.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your response. I want to take just a second before we move on to the panel to ask you a question from Mary. Sarah, could you let Mary know, if you stopped marine cloud brightening, would there be a heat shock on the climate?
Yeah, so if you, with any of these solar radiation modification approaches, if you did a lot of it and then stopped it completely suddenly, there would be a shock to the system. It would be important to have plans to not do that. And I think Jim would agree that while these approaches may be useful to reducing climate risk, we would ideally be in a position where we're using as little of them as possible. But that would be a really critical aspect of the governance and oversight of these approaches if anyone ever decided to actually implement them. I'm not sure why you would ever decide to suddenly stop doing them. And and the other things you can, with both of them, they could be done in smaller amounts. So you could use them in smaller amounts to reduce climate warming at a level that phasing them out would not produce a shock to the system. So it would really have to be an international oversight governance question of how to make sure that doesn't happen.
And I might just add in just very quickly that I completely 100% agree with everything that Sarah just said. And one of the concerns around stratospheric aerosol injection is the so-called termination shock effect, right? That if we were putting these aerosols up and for whatever reason we decided to do that, the system's going to try to equilibrate very quickly to the levels of carbon in the atmosphere. And that is why it is really, really critical that we understand that stratospheric aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening should not be the primary response to climate change. The primary response has to be reducing emissions and getting carbon levels lower in the atmosphere. So ideally, in that schematic that I showed in my presentation, the idea would be to do this in relative limited forms until those carbon levels achieve safer levels in the atmosphere.
Thank you, both Jim and Sarah. We will get back to questions. I'm seeing some wonderful questions in the Q&A, which I really want to get back to them. For now, I do also want to introduce, as part of this new upcoming intergenerational dialogue, three of the most distinguished youth leaders in the topic, who I'm sure also have some things to say when it comes to these topics. And just to very briefly introduce them, we have Irfan Ullah, who is the founder of Sustainability Week Pakistan, as well as an adaptation expert and an advisor for the Global Center on Adaptation. He is an international strategy fellow of SilverLining and has also collaborated with international multilateral organizations like UNICEF. Aside from Irfan, we have Lydia. Lydia is currently the contact and leading point of the YOUNGO Adaptation Working Group. YOUNGO is the official UN Youth Constituency, UNFCCC. She is also a young solar climate intervention researcher, completing her final year in environmental sciences at the University of College in London, and is as well an international strategy fellow for SilverLining. Finally, we have Yoti Singh from India. Yoti is a postdoctoral researcher at Rutgers University, and her research is also being funded by SilverLining through the Safe Climate Research Initiative, who seeks to involve researchers from the Global South. So thank you, the three, for being here. It's really going to be an honor to take this panel further. I wanted to pose the first question to Yoti. So Yoti, you are a young solar climate intervention researcher yourself. Can you tell us more about what your research entails and what motivated you to study this topic?
Hi, thank you for giving me the floor, and I'm really delighted to be a part of this. So to start with how I get involved into climate intervention research, I will have to start with my master's. So during my master's, I was looking at a question that why farmers in Indian Himalayan states were replacing their apple orchards, which is very economic, which was very profitable for them, with other fruit trees. And in my research, I found that it was because the winters in Indian Himalayan states were becoming milder and the snowfall was reducing. And it was because it was the reason that Indian farmers in those states were replacing apples with other fruit crops that requires comparatively mild winters and less snowfall. And as a result, and we also found in our study that it was projected to increase in future global warming scenarios, and it is going to be widespreading in other parts of the state. And as a response, the farmers in those states who are cultivating apples have to act at least 3 to 4 decades, earlier, because orchards are not like crops. They cost a lot, and when a farmer set up an orchard, they have in mind 3 to 5 decades. This is what is the lifespan of orchard is. So after finishing my master's, when I joined PhD, my advisor was the one who introduced me the term geoengineering, called climate intervention now. And he also proposed that this term has the potential to cool the planet and reduce the negative impacts that crop face because of increased temperature, especially we were focusing on Indian regions. And this was a time when it sparked my interest to see what will happen if if the climate intervention will take place, especially solar radiation management in Himalayan regions, and how will it save the apple orchards of the farmers. And this became an objective in my PhD. And so I'm currently a postdoc at Rutgers, and as there are many uncertainties of stratospheric aerosol injection, some of the important ones are it might change the ratio of diffused versus direct solar radiation. incoming ultraviolet radiation and also ozone concentrations. So currently I'm trying to improve crop models. So we will be able to better simulate both crop growth and crop production under the, climate intervention strategies. Yeah, so this will be it, and I'm excited to be part of this discussion.
Important work there, Yoti. Thank you so much. Lydia, I wanted to pose the same question to you. What has been your motivation and what is your research when it comes to solar climate interventions?
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and I'm very glad to be here along the distinguished panelists. So first of all, about my research, I've done research specifically on stratospheric aerosol injections for my dissertation. And more specifically, I'm looking at the impacts of a stratospheric aerosol injection on water availability in the African Sahel. And so for some background and context, the Sahel is a semi-arid region between the Sahara and the tropical forests in Africa. And the region is very highly prone to water scarcity. Many of the people who are living there are smallholder farmers and have really low adaptive capacity to changes in water availability. So the idea of my research is really to understand how will stratospheric aerosol injection impact the physical changes in water availability, and what happens if we introduce social change, for instance, population growth, and how the social and physical changes link together. And so for my research, I'm looking at the outputs of the models that are, for instance, built by scientists like Sarah and Jim. And the reason why I chose this topic is because while people are working on the physical aspects of stratospheric aerosol injection, there's currently not much research that can link these physical changes to societal impacts. So I'm really trying to close the interface between these fields of studies. And generally speaking, I'm just very passionate about fighting climate change, but I'm also a scientist at heart. So when I first started, I was actually interested in climate science in general, and then I got to know about solar aerosol injection, stratospheric aerosol injection, and other types of climate intervention during my studies. And I just found it a very interesting topic, and of course, it's also a very relevant topic. And I wanted to understand more of the potential of this approach to increase our resilience to climate change. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lydia. I understand that as a true climate leader, you also want to be involved in the science. I feel like we all feel the same in that way. And Irfan, when it comes to Pakistan, I remember at COP27 where we had the Pakistani pavilion and delegation, and it used to say what is going on in Pakistan is not going to stay there. And the effects that Pakistan had just happened due to climate change were a real reminder of, in a sense, what we can expect, unfortunately, especially for the rest of the nations of the global south. So from your experience, what do you think is the awareness of people in Pakistan, and especially of young people, when it comes to solar climate intervention? And how do you think this affects the research?
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and it's been a pleasure to be among the panelists. So yeah, talking about the overall journal awareness in Pakistan. And I will just give reference to one of our recent event that we held with the support of SilverLining, and we try to bring different stakeholder, government stakeholder, non-government stakeholder, and also key research institute on the table on the topic of climate intervention. So this year in February, we had an event in one of the prestigious University of Pakistan. It's called Bacha Khan University. And we also bring to the table Pakistan Red Crescent Society, which is NGOs working on climate in DRR, but they're focusing more on response mechanism. And also we bring Provincial Disaster Management Authority, which are taught, it's like a government agency tasked with tackling disaster in the country. But then we also try to bring academia and research, and we had also on the table the director from Center for Disaster Preparedness and Management. So our focus was meant to bring those different stakeholders and trying to kind of together explore the best way of implementation, or maybe to do some meaningful work on climate intervention in Pakistan. And there was also a lot of interest in the room. So the conference was for 1 day, and we had like 50+ students. And it was student, bachelor student, master student, PhD student, but there was also civil society organization presence in the room. And there was a lot of interest in the room. People were so motivated to learn more about the climate intervention and how it could be meaningfully and inclusively implemented in the scenario of Pakistan. Why Pakistan? Because Pakistan is among the most vulnerable country to climate change due to the recent flooding. It's make it everything obvious that the work which are currently being happening in Pakistan are the DRR and climate change adaptation, which we are implementing in Pakistan. It's not working, which is why we are having some like disaster, like the flooding in Kharkiv. So I think so bringing new I would say mechanism like climate intervention could be I would say meaningfully to somehow implement it and to see that how we can bring more, I would say, different stakeholder willing and interest. So the event went really well, and it has been also in the news in the 3 local newspaper, and they talk about the event. So overall, I would say it was a lot of interest in the room. But let me talk about the key takeaway from the event. So yeah, as there was a lot of interest, there was a lot of, I would say, motivation in the room from the different stakeholder. But then the capacity building and awareness raising on this, I would say, topic is still and I think it's not just in Pakistan, but if we talk overall global South, so there is not much been happening there, especially on the capacity building and awareness raising and involving academia, government stakeholder and non-government stakeholder. Another key takeaway was also somehow not, I would say, enough financial support from global now to flow to global South, especially in the topic of climate intervention, and to bring more stakeholders to the table. And I think that the most important is enabling environment. So there's, I would say, still big room and scope to have an enabling environment for topic like SRM to and also to have more local inclusion in participation of people. So that was somehow the overall, I would say, the stage from the event that we had in Pakistan. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Irfan. It's really important to hear about those local experiences. But I wanted to pose one of the questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A from Shreya, which I think is a very valid question that a lot of us as youth have all asked ourselves, I think, in a certain point. And just to read it as she wrote it textually, she said, "Thank you, Jim and Sarah, for your presentation. There has been wider concerns that technologies like SRM, CCS, etc., can be dangerous distraction to real climate solutions. What is your take on this?" So Sarah, Jim, again, I invite you to, if in case you have any remarks, as well as, of course, as part of the rest of the young leaders here.
Jim, you want to go ahead?
Sir. Well, yeah. So my reaction is, yeah, I mean, this has been a stated concern for a long time. And my very brief answer, because I know that we're up against time, I'm motivated, and my response to that question is motivated by the stories we've heard from Yodi and Lydia and Irfan and others. Climate change is happening. The impacts are really becoming very severe, and they're going to continue to increase in time. I don't think we can afford to not do the research on these topics to really understand what role they could play. We have to have all options on the table, given the severity of climate change impact. We have known about climate change. We've been projecting what those impacts are going to be. that has in general failed to produce the magnitude of emission reductions that we need to achieve to avoid some of these worst impacts. So doing the research is not an argument for deployment. Both Sarah and I have talked about the importance of really comprehensively understanding and addressing the uncertainties. We simply can't wait any longer to avoid or not really understand all of the options that we have at our disposal, including solar climate intervention.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add one thing to that, which is everything Jim said. And in addition, there's the cat's sort of already out of the bag that these things exist. And as climate disruption becomes worse, I think it's increasingly likely that governments, nations, whatever, will think about using these approaches. And then the choice will be either make that decision with good information or not with good information. And I think that's just the reality. And then, the other thing is the other reason we need to do the research, in addition to making good decisions about whether or not you'd want to use these things, in the case of marine cloud brightening in particular, is whether it's even an option for significantly cooling climate. As I mentioned, there are really complex ways the system could respond. So I think the research is needed to understand whether how feasible these approaches are, whether they really are actually options for cooling climate. And if you don't do the research, you also won't know whether or not there may be really negative consequences to doing them in specific ways. And so that's really critical, because I think people are going to consider using these, and I would much prefer that they had as much information to work with as possible.
Thank you, both Jim and Sarah. I agree. I think that what better decision making to do than informed decision making, correct? And when it comes to keeping 1.5 degrees alive, I think that also as youth, we cannot be naive on understanding the path that we're currently taking when it comes to overshoot. And I think that we really must keep 1.5 alive, especially for us in vulnerable nations and communities. So thank you again for your work and all of your support to this cause. Now, for this final remark, and again, since we are very over time, I just wanted to forward the last question here to GYLI. GYLI, what more needs to be done to increase research and to increase diversity in research when it comes to climate interventions?
Thank you for the question. I think if I talk from a perspective because I'm in India, so I completed my PhD in India, and when I started working on climate intervention was 2016, and I have not seen an increase in research, at least in terms of institutions in India, since 2016. So as far as I know, there are two prominent institutions: Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, where I did my PhD, and Indian Institute of Sciences, Bangalore. These two are the institutions that are doing research on any type of climate intervention. There are no other institution taking part in it. And I think it's very important that I think funding is one of the most important part, and funding is needed to do research. And I also think that if there are conferences and other things like that, we need to provide more funding and travel support and other type of financial support, especially to the global South nation and the students who might become, because of that, interested in the climate intervention research. So I think that's important, and also these kind of conferences might expose the researchers to this field. So I think the lack of funding and the lack of exposure are definitely two things that are limiting the research on climate intervention, and we need to improve and increase exposure.
Thank you. I believe that's a powerful message to close this panel. Again, let's keep 1.5 alive. I'm sure we will all be doing a lot in our fronts. I see that there are more questions. We will try to respond them on the chat. And for now, I wanted to pass it on to Maddie, our kind host, who will give us the next steps when it comes to the next sessions of this summit. Over to you, Maddie.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. And thank you to our fantastic panelists for the really enriching discussion. I just want to flag that is the end of session 1. If there are any other questions, queries, what have you, pop them in the chat, pop them on the Q&A, or you can reach out to us, GYLI at silverlining.ngo. Everything is there on the screen there. We've got QR codes to our website, also to the youth call to action. We'll get there. We'll explain that in a little bit. But yeah, sit back, relax, take a few minutes to unwind, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us. I hope you feel refreshed. Now we are going to begin the second session of today, which is International Governance of Solar Climate Intervention. The moderator for the session will be Joshua Amponson. I introduced him at the beginning. He is also an International Strategy Fellow at SilverLining. So with that, I'd like to call to the floor the Executive Director of SilverLining, Kelly Wanzer. She'll be doing a presentation today to get us thinking about these big international governance questions. So just to introduce Kelly. Hi, Kelly, how are you? So yeah, just to introduce her a little bit further. So prior to founding SilverLining, Kelly co-founded and is also a senior advisor to the University of Washington Marine Cloud Brightening Project. So that's the project for which Professor Sarah Doherty manages. Kelly is also a member of the President's Circle of the US National Academy of Sciences, where she works with prominent scientists and science funders to advance strategic priorities for the US. So thank you so much, Kelly, for joining us, and I'm really looking forward for you to share your insights with us today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Maddie, and thank you for organizing this amazing event with Global Young Leaders. I am really heartened to see the conversation here and the level of interest from all of you who joined the meeting. The generation that you're part of is one of the motivations for SilverLining in terms of how we think about the problem that we're facing. And SilverLining, my organization, is focused on near-term climate risk, how we think about the next 30 to 50 years, where, as Professor Earle mentioned, the climate system is projected to continue to warm. So it turns out that lots of people in all parts of the world are on the front lines of that and experiencing lots of impacts now, and those impacts are expected to grow. But one of our concerns from a point of view of governance, one of the motivations that we have in thinking about this problem is the fact that there are a couple of big parts of society that really didn't create the problem, but are faced with the impacts of it. And one is, of course, the young people of the world who weren't part of the accumulation of greenhouse gases up to now. And the other are the people in the most vulnerable parts of the world, which tend to be in the places that are less developed and did a lot less of the historical emissions. So in the context of the problem we have a really important, very acute safety problem for lots of people. Very bad things are projected over the next 30 years that are baked in to the climate pathways that we have with emissions reduction. And those include displacement of maybe 1 billion people, lots of suffering, lots of economic cost, and a lot of loss of life. So one of the questions that we ask in terms of governance, in terms of justice is, can we improve the safety profile of the context that we're in? And can we think about doing that in ways that really consider the equity for young people and for people in vulnerable parts of the world? So in that context, the conversation around climate intervention is emerging partly as a conversation about how can we reduce impacts. So we're starting to see in different parts of the world, different countries and stakeholders looking at ways to try to address drought, to try to address flooding. So interventions at local and regional levels, and then thinking about the kind of global climate interventions that we've talked about here as these impacts escalate. And so as people start to, look at these questions and policymakers face more pressure from different parts of their communities as to how to help address these impacts, then we ask ourselves the question, how could the world make decisions about these things? And how could we make decisions in ways that are equitable and effective? So one of the things we did in SilverLining is we worked with international environmental law experts to look at that very question and to say, what are the governance mechanisms that exist that are linked to these kinds of problems, and where are they successful and where are they less successful? And we came to find kind of the gold standard for success was the Montreal Protocol that governs the ozone layer. So this is the UN body that includes both scientific and technical expert panels to evaluate the chemicals that affect the ozone layer, and then a political body that makes decisions about actions to take. And it turns out that that combination of bodies together has been the most successful in human history in producing good environmental outcomes. It also happens that that body is the only one that includes all of the countries of the world in a binding treaty. And what that means is, though it's not perfectly equitable, from a participation perspective, it's one of the most effective in the world at including all countries with a voice and with a meaningful voice in the processes and mechanisms in play. So it happens to be both very good environmentally and very good politically. And so we kind of look at that as a starting point of what might be possible for the world to make decisions together. And so you can see here the meeting of the Montreal Protocol last year, where they were actually celebrating both the success of the protection of the ozone layer, as well as the GYLI amendment, which expanded their efforts to include substances that were really about greenhouse gases and climate. So this treaty not only is the most effective in terms of protecting the ozone layer, but it turns out that it's been the most effective at reducing greenhouse gases of any of the international mechanisms. So really interesting, and lots of really interesting dynamics to look at. But one of the important ones is the way that they use science and evidence to drive decision-making. Next slide. And so, so this introduced us to the concept of, in international environmental law, of the assessment of safety, and really trying to use evidence to look at, what are the projected impacts of an activity at scale, human activity at scale, and how do they compare to different responses, in this case, climate interventions. So it's really about, can we produce more information that will help us assess very rigorously, very openly, very honestly, and very subject to debate, what the safety profile is of projected warming under climate change, and what the safety profile is of climate interventions. And so, so the research that Sarah and Jim talked about really are in service of being able to do that kind of assessment and to make that information available openly to people in all parts of the world. And this is linked to the study that Jim mentioned earlier. So one of the developments in the international arena is at the level of the UN bodies, really bringing scientists together to look at these questions and to ask whether this area is something that should be explored, and if so, how and why. So the United Nations Environmental Program recently issued a report called One Atmosphere, where they had held a workshop of scientific experts. And that report also recommended research in the context of both the level of climate risk that we have and the likelihood that people will go down the path that Sarah mentioned of exploring these things. And that the best context for us to be in is one where we have good information, where it's shared openly, and where we have a place and mechanisms for all countries, stakeholders, and people from different parts of the world to weigh in. And in particular, young people, and in particular, people from the global South and vulnerable parts of the world who have, arguably the most moral standing in terms of what happens next. So this is a little bit of an overview of how we think about the problem. There are lots of different kinds of questions in the context of governance, but one of the dynamics that I wanted to raise that's important to consider is that the things that Sarah and Jim talked about, the kinds of technologies and scientific depth of activity that we need to answer questions is really significant. And a lot of that exists in the global north. Supercomputers, airplanes that can fly in the stratosphere. You see a picture of one here. Chambers that can emulate the stratosphere, that can emulate clouds. We need those kind of capabilities to work on the problem. But at the same time, you really need the involvement of Global South experts so that people in different parts of the world can call on their own experts and can ask their own questions about what this means for impacts for welfare in their parts of the world. So one of the really important considerations, and Irfan raised this, is how we build capacity for Global South research expertise and ultimately the adoption of some of these advanced capabilities so they can have really informed and equitable seats at the table. And how can we foster scientific and technical cooperation for across different parts of the world so that we're all looking at these things together. So I'll stop there and turn back for discussion on these really important issues.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's great to hear this very awesome presentation coming from the lens of course, welfare, equity, and safety, and near-term climate risk. The first two images were very powerful and reminded me of this new series on Apple TV called Extrapolation, and looking at how realistically the next few years could look for us. My name is Joshua Thompson again. I'm very happy to be here. I've been involved in this conversation, and my own background comes from doing a master research at the United Nations University, looking at adaptation for very sort of vulnerable communities and countries like Mozambique, which have suffered cyclones upon cyclones, and how do we build resilience and adaptation for certain places. And the plain truth is that there are limits to adaptation, and we cannot adapt to everything. And this is very clear. And the new IPCC report, the AR6 have also mentioned that there will be soon, if we do not really increase our actions, we are going to see irreversible impact. Kelly, you've mentioned in your presentation very clearly that we need research to advance. Jane mentioned about that, Sarah talked about it. Now the question for what you said, how do we unlock that? So how do we really get that research piece to be done in an equitable way? What are the stumbling blocks at the moment? So, and how do we get Global South, and particularly the countries who are really at the front lines, how do we get them to be able to do some of these research and lead the conversation on this? So it would be very, very great to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's definitely a problem that we came across that we weren't familiar with, when we started this work. That there's it's a general problem in climate research that experts from the Global South, there's a lot of talent in the Global South, a lot of really strong scientific and other types of talent, but there's a gap in terms of funding. A very noteworthy, significant gap that we didn't expect to find. So there aren't really places for climate researchers to go and just, apply for grants in a really significant way. They sort of live in pockets. And so when it comes to climate intervention, where, it's almost like the bar is a little bit higher, people say, we really want this. We really want equity. We really want better information. And then we say, okay, actually, we really need to fix this situation, or at least improve it, where there are more, really substantive pockets of funding where Global South experts can apply for grants to do work that is driven their own way, where they're asking their own questions and even living in their own countries. Today, what's often happening is people from the Global South, like Yoti, go to the US, they go to Europe, they study there, and then they have a hard time coming back and having a path for their work. And so there's a lot more that the Global North can do in terms of establishing real funding mechanisms for that. And it's really important in the context of climate intervention, but it's also important in general. There are also technology barriers. And a big one for doing impacts research is supercomputing, because the climate modeling, these data sets are massive, the models are massive. It's really big science. So we worked with Amazon Web Services to put climate models and data sets onto the cloud. So it's sort of like Netflix for climate science, where we have a shot at people going onto the internet, not having to rely on their, maybe slower networks to pull down these big data sets, being able to work in the cloud. We're still working on that, and that needs work because it's technically challenging to get that stuff running smoothly. So those kinds of things where we, focus on enabling technology and have sources of funding, we think those are really important, and we want to move on them fast.
Great, Kelly. I mean, I want to acknowledge the diversity of people in the audience. I've seen folks from most part of the African countries who have done some of my work. So folks who are here really acknowledging your presence and sort of taking interest in this conversation. Given the diversity of people in the room, in the virtual room, and what you're talking to now, I want you to also probably emphasize on the risk. So you're saying that we need funding to get global South engagement, but it's also sort of that technological a gap in terms of capacity. Now, what is the risk if we do not advance equitable research across climate intervention? What will be the risk if we do not address this very soon? Because I know that, I mean, for young people, one thing that we do the best is advocacy. We have, of course, young professionals, we have young scientists, and we do a lot of work in different spaces, but advocacy is something that consistently young people have been championing over the last decade when it comes to climate action. And I want to use this opportunity for you to inform the audience we have in the room. If there's one thing worth advocating for, what would that be? And I think that probably for me, from what I'm hearing from you, is that there are certain gaps now. And to be able to advocate for that, it will be good to know what are the risks that we stand to face if we do not address these gaps that you just mentioned.
Well, I think the risk that if we're not advocating for, real science and science capacity for people from the global South in different parts of the world, and also having young scientists there, is that, even if you get some level of participation in decision-making, it's not informed by the realities. And so you're at a disadvantage. People are at a disadvantage in terms of information, and in particular, in terms of information that's relevant to them in where they are in the world. And what that means is then either, you're sort of this set of people is sort of less, really less meaningful participant in decision making, but it can also actually increase misunderstandings, it can increase hostilities, it can actually make the world less stable. So if we're not all seeing the same things, people start to get very concerned. And if you don't have your own experts to talk to, and you're getting told things by people in the global North about these things, then that's a very uncomfortable world to be in. So I think there's, we think that it promotes both equity, but also like better prospects at like peaceful, mutually agreed action versus, things where people aren't agreeing and the world gets, less cooperative.
No, thanks a lot, Kelly. That is very great to hear, and I think there's a big word to everyone around how urgent it is to really ensure that. And if you look at the country you're living in, or where you're joining from, what universities have the research capacity to do this? What are the financing mechanisms to undertake studies and be part of research like this? And I think that is very important to really start looking into that and start asking those questions. Thank you very much, Kelly. And I will start welcoming panelists for the intergenerational dialogue. I'm very, very happy to have Nishat with us today. Nishat is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Arab Youth Climate Movement. And Nishat has been fantastic in the youth climate movement in the Arab region, bringing young people together to lead a climate sort of conversation advocacy, but also policy engagement. And he also leads the stakeholder engagement for the Global Carbon Council. So Nisha, really happy to have you here. Kelvin from Ghana, Kelvin Starr, nice to have you here. Kelvin has been on the forefront as a young leader with expertise in geospatial engineering and has been working with young people on this issue as well. So really happy to have you here. And then Brenda, who is very active in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, official youth constituency, having played a fundamental part in that constituency. Brenda, really nice to have you here. And she's also the Chief Operations Officer for Green Girls Platform. And then lastly, I'm welcoming Joyashree Roy from India, who is the founder and director for South and Southeast Asia Multidisciplinary Research Network on Transforming Societies of Global South, with this short form called SMART. So really happy to have all of you here for this panel. What, as a good way to move from Kelly's presentation and to come into this intergenerational panel, I will go to you first, Joyashree. You've been working on adaptation, and I think rightfully so. When it comes to the impact of climate change, adaptation is needed now, and it faces the same challenges. Financing is not coming in. We are seeing increasing impact, and India has seen some of the worst of it. From your perspective, where does solar climate intervention stand currently for the impact that you've seen and for your work on adaptation?
Hi, this is really very good, and I'm really thankful to you all for giving me this opportunity to take part in the intergenerational dialogue, and which is really need to happen. So I'm really happy that I'm here because these impacts and the actions need to happen over multiple decades. And so what happens today and what action is taken today would determine what will happen in say 2-3 decades, 5 decades later. So this is really important that the overlapping generation discussion really need to happen. What I want to say first is that we need to understand, we have heard from in the first session also, but what I would like to repeat again, because this is something which needs to be reiterated over and over again, that if we just see that why this dialogue need to happen now and need to happen at much larger scale than just one of its kind webinar like this, right? So as you all have seen that this March, the last scientific assessment report of IPCC in the 6th assessment cycle got published. And before that, UNEP GAP report was also published. And both are clearly showing that the pace and scale of climate action are clearly insufficient to tackle climate change. But it is also showing that for mainstreaming many climate action that can reduce emission as well as help in adaptation need 3 to 6 times more than the current investment. And that's what we are also talking, that we need more investment for research and for experimentation and for dialogue so that we are well prepared for taking any informed decision. Also, what I want to say is that this is also very clear that all these need actions in the form of political commitment, inclusive governance, international cooperation, effective ecosystem stewardship, and sharing of diverse knowledge. And in the knowledge space, it is very clear that mitigation and adaptation actions need to continue anyway, everywhere, and at a faster speed. Otherwise, insufficiency in climate action will increase further, leading to more widening of emission gap. So there are also growing scientific literature, as we heard in the first session also, that which are trying to show how the mitigation gap can be imagined to be filled by going beyond mitigation and adaptation through deployment of 2 categories of solution: alternative carbon dioxide removal mechanism and technologies, and through application of solar radiation modification technologies. So over these years, a community has shown what are the wider benefits of mitigation and adaptation options and what are the possible trade-offs. So what I want to say is that, so in the whole climate action research, now what is dominating is that how can we have a triple win through mitigation, adaptation, as well as sustainable development? Can we select the actions which can help making 3 wins together so that the faster scaled up action can be beneficial for the society and for everybody? So but as I said, this has happened in sequential order for mitigation and adaptation for a very long time. But that luxury we do not have anymore now, because now we need to know simultaneously while the technology is developing, what is its implication in terms of wider benefit and trade-off with sustainable development dimensions of these new emerging technologies. What are the cost implications? More important for those to know because they have wider ethical, socioeconomic, geopolitical, and justice questions interlinked. Just to give an example, in the ethical question, the question is coming up, it does not address the root cause of global warming and is expected to come with its own set of environmental and social risks and problems. So are we really prepared? Do we really know? And are the social scientists and humanities experts are involved in the whole research to see simultaneously and not sequentially the implication of these new technologies on the societal and the human well-being aspects? And if we look into the geopolitical and justice question, they are also interlinked because we do not yet know what will be for smaller intervention, what might be the impact across regions, and also with regard to different climate parameters such as precipitation, and also, as it has been said in the first session, that rapid warming upon sudden termination of the intervention, and also what is the impact on human health or ecosystem health of the airborne particles, ozone layer. So there are several serious governance challenges to national and international institutions. And my concern is that we have seen, despite all this knowledge of wider impacts, benefits, low cost options for mitigation and adaptation, things are not progressing in this fragmented world where the world is divided in terms of collective action. So I would say, I mean, because there are many others in the panel, but my position is that what is really needed is that to enable any science-based recommendation in near term to come up with a thorough and critical research on both the climate, CDR and the SRM is desirable, so there can be inclusive and informed decision-making for sustainable development. And my humble request will be, while we are talking about experimentation and technology development, unless social scientists and humanity experts are involved from the very beginning in an interdisciplinary way, we will not know what kind of governance means is needed for what kind of technology development and what will be the implication. And so how do you really manage through the different governance models? So this is extremely important. We do not go for sequential research, which takes 30 to 40 years. We really need to do it now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jayashri. That was very powerful. And I picked 3 things which I'll reiterate before I move on to the next speaker. One, we are racing against time. We don't have time and we cannot go by sequence. So simultaneously, we need to explore all options. The second point, which is very, very important, is that there is a lot of unanswered questions, and that can only be found, like we can only find out that through research. So research, and research, which is very, very important. And then the third point is that all the options we know now, which are, we could call them real climate actions, have not delivered on their promise on actually fighting climate change yet, which means that we cannot rely on them alone, and we need to start digging deeper and dig into other options following the best recommended science. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Really powerful to have your perspective on this. I'll quickly move to our youth panelists, and I'm going to start with you, Nishat. I know that it's been 2 years since you had a youth call to action from the GYLI, and one of the things that, of course, came out of this process was consulting with a lot of young people on what needs to be done to increase youth participation in climate intervention research and work in general. And Matt is going to put this link to the youth call to action into the chat for people to have access to. Nisha, the question to you is, what's been in terms of progress since that youth call to action came out 2 years ago? And what do you think are still the remaining hurdles for us to really start implementing the principles of the youth call to action, which is really making sure that young people are the center of this conversation, are given the resource, the expertise, and the technical capacity to engage on this?
Well, thank you, Josh, and thanks, Kelly, for the great presentation again, and Jayashri for the interventions regarding adaptations and where we are and giving that foresight. Well, coming back to your question, Joshua, I think we made good progress ever since we started the youth call for action. I think good strides. At least we can see we've been able to capitalize on a couple of our last COP, and more young people are engaging in this dialogue. And we're happy to see a lot of young people are interested in working or looking at this aspects, because we are in a way tired of what we have been seeing. Like Jayashri mentioned, the emission gap report is astonishing. It is showcase we have not reached anywhere. We are still fighting climate action, and seeing that gap is getting not any better. People are looking at the alternate way of doing it. For us in the Middle East here, we have no choice. And some of the things we are talking about is about disaster coming up, hitting some countries, but we are living in that reality every day. Water scarcity, worst in the world. I've given this space, the World Bank report says that almost 47% of young people will be impacted at the space of water scarcity in the region. So we need more technological interventions to bring more water here. The temperature rise is going to be, as mentioned, 2 degrees plus. What are other ways to help us? So we don't need a disaster. We are living in a disaster in a day-to-day basis. So we cannot wait. So I think more and more young people realizes this thing. And since then, I have seen a lot of strides with young people in the region taking up climate science researchers. But again, how many and what are their capacity level of researchers in our part of the world are very, very limited to a few rich countries. There are many countries which don't able to afford. So funding is still a huge thing. And young people to get into higher research institutes outside their countries are very minimal. I mean, there should be more opportunities like scholarship to work on climate intervention researchers outside the region and bring that knowledge to their own countries. It is very, very limited. You can just number how many get this opportunity to do so. So I think as the call for action showed a lot of lack of information within young people, it is still there. And I think the funding of such projects need to be supported by especially rich countries and especially our friends from the global north. So I think we have made some progress, but it really needs a lot of efforts to move forward.
Great. Thanks, Nishat. Lots of efforts are needed, and I'm going to turn to Kelvin, who in Ghana got the chance to talk to a bunch of young people in a very fun way, in a sort of a movie night, trying to introduce them to this very complicated topic sometimes when you're not in the scientific field. As a layperson hearing aerosol injection, you're like, whoa, what is that? So again, thanking James and Sarah and the scientists with us who sort of really took their time to explain this to us. But Kevin, back to you. What do you see as the main way to get people to understand this topic much better? Of course, we only have 60 or so people in this call. I know that, of course, when it comes to as a geospatial person, you know that no everyday person can easily understand the work that you do and the work that all these fantastic scientists are doing. But we need them to be part of this, let's say. And you, in a very fun way, got young people about it to get them to understand what is happening. My question to you is that we know there is increasing risk. We know the conversation needs to get more equitable. We know governments need to get more equitable. We need more research. But what is the starting point for young people? How do we start getting that interest in the first place for a topic like this so that they can really join the advocacy and start pursuing careers and development pathways in this field?
Okay. Thank you very much, Joshua. I'm so pleased to hear from you here, and thank you to all my panelists and everyone listening. I think it's a very interesting conversation. Now, if we want to start the discussion, I think it's very important to look at the current scenario in the world where we find ourselves. So we realize that first and foremost, we're in a very digital era where there's a lot of technology trends, a lot of AI and all of that around us. So with this YCA policy document that was put out, for instance, many youth out there probably did not even hear of it. So I think one of the major ways to start is with a collective social mobilization strategy. It's a very digital world now. So when such things come up, it's very good to try and find a creative way through probably a Twitter scheme or some interesting social media trend, sort of push this down to the very technical and untechnical people, because most of the times you realize that you find people who are always in the climate space attending climate events. And those who are in the entertainment space, those who are in real estate, those who are in other areas or agencies or industries that do not really have direct link to the climate fight or climate intervention might not really want to even get involved. However, the important thing to notice here is that whether they decide to get involved or not, all of us collectively face the challenges and problems. All we have to do is, just as any business, go out there to try and go with a business idea to fight for sponsorships, fight for funding, just like what we're doing now. We're looking for funding to try and map the risk, looking for funding to try and showcase how we can improve and climate intervention, all of that. I think it's good from our own point where we stand, probably for me in Ghana where I sit, to start on my own. How can I learn some digital skills on my own to map the land surface temperature, which is always rising, causing some sort of warming and affecting farmlands in my area? And I continually post that on my status. I post that on Twitter. I create some noise in my own small space. We have a lot of young people across the world undertaking such activities, learning some skills, starting from wherever they are without any foreign funding. If that collectively drives a social mobilization, it will get to the point where we are going to be so noticeable, we cannot be ignored. And at that point, I'll say it's a great starting point.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think taking it from a very local perspective on understanding your own risk, which of course differs from place to place, depending on vulnerability. And now moving to a bit of a global stage, I'm going to turn to Brenda. Brenda, you are very active in the UNFCCC process. And as we head towards COP28, and after everything you've heard, my question to you is, how can we really center conversations around this as young people towards COP28? How do we deliver on these principles, which for those who don't know about them, Maddie has also shared this in the chat. But how do we really make this part of our advocacy and the movement that we are building towards COP28? And from your personal perspectives, what should be our ambition when it comes to solar climate intervention, and really making sure that we are delivering a better future for young people and of course for future generations when it comes to climate risk. So really keen to hear from you on that as someone who is involved in the COP process.
All right, thanks so much, Joshua. I think a lot has already been highlighted by Nishad and Carvin, but Jorashi. So I'll just leverage from what they've already shared. So for me, I would say I think we need more coordination and partnerships as young people, because as much as we're doing advocacy, the advocacy things that work that we're doing, others are involved in like education, climate education, like at ground level, grassroots level, and there are others who are actually like as activists, you know. But then for all of that to happen, we need, for us to push our advocacy agenda, we need evidence-based advocacy. And for that to happen, we need to include research. It means somebody has to go in the field, get the data. I mean, it's high time that we actually go in the field and actually understand what's going on in like in the field, like
for example, this year, Malawi has been hit by Cyclone Freddy, but then like the data that's there, like what's the extent of like the damage? If somebody was asking me last week to say, how much does Malawi need to recover from like the loss and damage? I mean, I don't even have the answer right now because we really don't have people who are actually on ground and who can actually provide the data that we need. The data that we have is like, okay, this is like the amount of people that have been displaced. This is how many people have died from this, but then that's not actually that's happening on ground. Like there's some missed data. So we really need young people who can actually go in there and like find the data that we can like. I shouldn't be going on the internet and actually be seeing like papers that other people have actually written about Malawi to say, okay, this is the impact that Malawi has actually faced out of this. We need scaling up local researchers who can actually go in the field and actually give us the data so that when we are negotiating at global level, we should be doing that with like evidence to say this is like the this is the data that we have. This is the data that we've accumulated out of there. And as even young people, when we're going there, when we're doing our advocacy work, we should be there like pushing it with like evidence-based advocacy. And that I think it will actually carry weight because it actually shows you know what you're talking about. If we are like pushing for adaptation fund, if we are pushing for loss and damage fund, it should be something that we actually know, because I shouldn't just be pushing for loss and damage fund, but asking me how much money I need, like Malawi need, and I have no idea. It actually shows that whatever I'm pushing for, like there's no leverage, there's no foundation in that. So as young people, also as we are pushing as advocates and all of that, I think we should also, and as negotiators inside the negotiation rooms, like when you're giving a submission, also it should be something that's like backed up with data, like real data.
Yeah.
This is like the extent of like the damage, or for example the extent of how much is needed for like recovery. So I think there's much I can share, but for
Thanks.
now let me stop.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, Brenda. Thanks a lot. And I think I'm going to emphasize one thing which links up to something that Kelly said before. Of course, Kelly talked about how funding is really needed. Now you're talking about funding, but even more specifically for data and sort of research, even understanding risk, which is something that Calvin also talked about. So I think that one primary thing that I'm picking up from this conversation is that there is definitely that need for a Global South Research Fund, which needs to really be a priority for us as we head towards COP28, as something that we can all really rally behind. I'm going to pick a question from the Q&A from Modesta Lane, and Modesta, thanks for this question, which reads, what policy outlook specifically targeting Global South would enable more youth policymakers invest in this to promote localization of this research and technology? And I'm going to turn to you, Kelly, for this as we try to wrap up this panel, to hear from you on this question, but also to understand broadly the concerns raised. Of course, you talk about the need for funding, but how do we really unlock this? And if there are some key points that you want people to take with them, that'd be very important, and particularly towards COP28, things that we could jointly advocate for. So Modesta's question around what policy targets should we look out for? How do we ensure localization of this research and technology? And how do we unlock the finance bit and advocate for that in the lead up to COP28? Kelly, over to you.
I'll mention an effort that Jim Hurl, who you heard from earlier, is involved today, the World Climate Research Program. So to really scale what's needed for research capacity, we think like the mechanisms that exist in the WMO and the World Climate Research Program might be really good. And so because we're interested, it's really, and philanthropy can play a role too, but I think, we need meaningful scale in what's available. So the World Climate Research Program is looking at setting up an initiative on climate intervention. And I think support for that in terms of something that could provide equitable influence on research, and also potentially create a mechanism for how research funding might scale, could be a really good thing. So I think that's one thing. I think putting, your voices out there to say this is important. We need data, we need real expertise, we need real participation that extends across the COP negotiating community, but also philanthropy, where a lot of philanthropic money goes into climate change and climate voices, but not enough of it is getting really to the global South. And not enough of it is getting really to your organizations on the ground, and not enough of it is getting, or any of it is getting to global South research. And so you guys, one of the reasons I like working with you is because you teach me, how you help elevate, and I'm trying to help connect you. But I think we do need to elevate that message hard, that you guys, you're talented, you have your own experts, you need the resources to be able to be on more equal ground with what's going on, and to look at what's going on in your part of the world.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thanks everyone on this panel. We're really against time, and I wanted to have one from everyone, but in the interest of time, thanks all of you. I'm going to pass it back to the host, Maddie, to take us to the next section. Thank you so much, my panelists. Really fantastic response, and thanks for sharing your insights with us. Maddie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Josh, and to the panelists for that discussion. A lot to think about. I wish we had more time because there were so many fantastic points made throughout that. So yeah, thank you for sharing your insights. That is the end of session 2. We are diving straight into session 3, which is a mere 10 minutes. So please do not go anywhere, because we have a short presentation from a youth group from Finland who are doing some fantastic work on climate intervention in their own region in the Arctic and nationally in Finland. So with that, I'd like to call up Operatio Arctis to the floor. And we have, of course, our fantastic moderator, Ricardo, with us to help guide us through. So just to give you a lowdown, Operatio Arctis were set up to promote research on climate intervention methods, and also to disseminate and popularize research on these methods, as well as other major scientific questions relevant for the Arctic and Finland, such as tipping points. So we have Lassie with us here today, as well as Ellen and Dagmar from the organization. Hi, guys. And with that, please take the floor, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about your efforts over in Finland. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maddie. So hi everyone, I am Lassi Laakso from Operatio Arctis, and I'm very happy to be presenting today. Just quickly, I want to thank Maddie and SilverLining for inviting us to speak, and everyone who has presented or spoken so far for being honest about the situation we're in, and we're still trying to find equitable solutions to it. So Operatio Arctis is a youth-found and youth-led project in Finland. Our team consists of 16 youths between the ages of 20 and 28. Our mission is to stop Arctic summer sea ice loss, and our political target is to get Finland to contribute to research on climate interventions that could preserve the year-round Arctic sea ice. So why is the Arctic sea ice so important for us? Arctic is heating up 4 times faster than the globe on average. The volume of Arctic summer sea ice has decreased by 75% in 50 years, and the extent of it has decreased by at least 40%. And the sea ice reflects the incoming solar radiation, which means that it cools the planet. So when the Arctic warms, the sea ice shrinks, which causes further warming, and so on. And this is called ice albedo feedback. The disappearing of the sea ice has drastic consequences. It drives other climate systems towards their tipping points, which is catastrophic for the whole climate system and people around the world. And it is often said that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. The disappearing of the sea ice has severe impacts for the local people and ecosystems as well. And when the sea ice shrinks, the Arctic Ocean opens for economic and military activities, and this combined with the Russian invasion of Ukraine creates geopolitical tensions in the Arctic. So in the next slide, you can see the Arctic sea ice at its largest and its smallest. So on the left is the year 1900 and on the right is the year 2022. So this illustrates how rapidly, especially the summer sea ice, has decreased. So what is then needed to preserve the Arctic sea ice? So firstly, we need to accelerate mitigation efforts, which means rapid phasing out of fossil fuels. We also need to eliminate black carbon emissions that make the sea ice less reflective. And also we need to enhance carbon dioxide removal. These are topics that are more widely discussed. However, it's very likely that these measures alone are not sufficient to preserve the year-round sea ice in the Arctic. And this is why Operatio Arctis thinks that we need to research ways to increase the Earth's reflectivity through solar radiation management or solar climate interventions. And two of the most promising techniques currently are stratospheric aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening, which we already heard about. So what are we then doing concretely in order to achieve our goals? We're lobbying politicians, government officials, and embassies. We're popularizing science around climate science, tipping points, and climate repair through events and social media. And we're connecting with scientists for the latest knowledge about these things and NGOs in the environmental field and other NGOs as well. And we've also been trying to connect with Arctic indigenous organizations, as they are in a very crucial role for anything that's happening in the Arctic. And here is a picture of our event, which was called Climate Repair and Civil Society. Then we have recently had some success with our lobbying work. Finland had parliamentary elections a month ago, and they are currently forming a new government. And in the Finnish political system, the upcoming government writes a government program that guidelines the policies for the next 4 years. And we've been talking with the party's representatives, and currently the Finnish Coalition Party is advancing our suggestion to be included in the upcoming government program. And I don't think I have the time to read our suggestions through, but basically it says that Finland sets the preservation of the Arctic sea ice as a political target and promotes internationally cooperative research on the techniques and their governance. Over the last months, we've also been working on our publication, Arctic Endgame, which will be published on May 17th. There we will be going through the kind of fundamental parts of our message that I have briefly explained in this presentation. And we will also be discussing some questions about solar climate intervention governance, about which we also heard some discussions earlier. So you guys have made it easy for me, as you have already kind of explained all the important stuff, so I don't have to here. And with Arctic Endgame, our aim is to spread awareness about these topics and open the discussion here in Finland. And it will also be published in English, so you should stay tuned for it. that was all. Here's our contact information. So please contact us if you became interested, and please ask if you have any questions. I have Ellen and Dagmar with me here to answer your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I wish we could see all the virtual applauses here, but at least for me, and coming back from Honduras, it's really inspiring to see different collectives of youth getting together, speaking to politicians, which I know how hard that is, right? And in a sense, convincing them that what we need to do is that we need to get more solutions in the table. We need to protect what we have, and essentially the little that is left of what we have when it comes to the Arctic, right? So again, just wanted to take this little moment to recognize all of your work, to close off with a good section of showcasing this national youth action, and to bring a little invitation to the participants here to ask any questions to you. Now, I wanted to start this Q&A with a very, I say a question that we get a lot as youth, but I wanted to hear it from your context in working with the government of Finland, which is, what have been your biggest, perhaps, I would say, limitations, or in a sense, what has been like the biggest challenges you have faced while doing this work?
Do you want to go first, Ellen?
Well, I can start by saying that obviously there's lack of awareness, considering especially solar climate interventions, but also climate risks and tipping points in Finland in general. So we have had to do a lot of work to ourselves understand better also all these topics. So that has required a lot of work and been a challenge also with discussing with politicians, for example.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, go ahead, Dagmar. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, you all. And also, from my point of view, it's kind of challenge to know what is the right time to contact and who, even though here in Finland we're a small country and like we have small circles here, and government officials are like easily giving us like places to speak because they like to involve young people here into decision-making processes, but sometimes it's not that easy to know who to contact or things like that.
Yeah, I hear that completely. Wow, I just think that, well, thinking about our work and thinking about how many ministries and how many secretaries, and it's just difficult to get to know who is the right person to contact, to get to know where and how to get these conversations going is very tough. I have a lot of personal questions, but I just see one from the Q&A popping up from Mary, which says, how did your group get started? And what are your tips on creating a youth climate action group that is listened to and that just doesn't remain on the silence?
Well, all of us have like some years behind already doing climate activism in different kinds of groups. So we have some kind of experience already when we formed this group. But I think the most important thing is just, well, we were a group of friends who shared the same idea and some visions to just clarify them, and then just have courage to approach scientists, approach other activists, important stakeholders, and ask for help. So I think that's most important step to take. So be active on that, on like approaching other people and asking for help. as we have done, for example, in the case of SilverLining, and that's why we are here also. So thanks for that.
Yeah, definitely. And also I'd like to add that my point of view, messaging and like things to say are the key point. And we have been having a lot of discussion on how to kind of take new perspective or some new ideas or some, in a way, new approach to this problem, so that the message doesn't sound the same discourse as it has been already, like decades. So maybe that's one advice I would like to say. So yeah, it's not that concrete, but anyway, the words and messages are the key point, I think.
No, I think that's where you have to start, right? And I feel like if I could add something, I feel like also working on the convictions and the purpose as a group is also very important. I just believe that for a successful organization to come together and to get these messages across, you first need to be convinced yourself, right? And at least that's what I'm seeing here. I feel like you're all a group of people that are very convinced about the need of additional solutions in the table, about the need of keeping 1.5. I remember once I saw a presentation where, by the way, not related to what I was saying, but they were saying that 1.5 degrees in the tropics might be equivalent to 3 times that in the Arctic and in the poles. So we could be speaking about potentially over 6 degrees of warming in the Arctic, which is it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable, and definitely I just believe that once you aligned your convictions with your message, I think that every young person can be surprised of how far we can get, right? And I know we're a bit over time, but again, one of the questions that I want to be very mindful of is that lots of the participants that are here today are also youth that are perhaps either thinking of starting their organization or are perhaps thinking, okay, this was interesting, but how do I take the next step? How can I get involved more meaningfully in the future? So what would be your recommendations to try to start these dialogues within your countries or within local stakeholders? What would be your top recommendations?
Well, that's a really important question. And maybe in addition of what I already said about like being active on approaching people and asking for help, one thing that has worked for us in Finland is that actually when many authorities or politicians and climate actors might seem like that they want to listen to young people and they want to like show off that we are collaborating with young people, when actually it's not really effective always. Always young people are not like actually allowed to participate in the actual decision making and the actual rooms where decisions are made or so. When we have sort of been able to take advantage from of that, how some actors might like want to like invite us and listen us, and then we have been able to turn it into actually working together and actually collaborating. So on our side, it requires being active and really like pushing for actual collaboration to happen with maybe some actors that have more power and have more room to share with us, sort of. That should be something that can help. At least it has been helpful for us in Finland in some ways.
Yeah, and if I might have one opportunity to add, it comes just to the working part, like thing I want to always remind myself at least is that the world is kind of humans world, in the sense that you whatever you're doing it with humans. So be kind and friendly to others. That's my advice.
No, for sure. I think that that's something that we need to be very mindful of. Sometimes when it comes to solutions, the conversations get divisive, and it's not about that. I think that all of us here are all worried that we see that the path that the world is going and the governments are going is not the right path, and that we need to constructively and meaningfully advocate for solutions that will get us to in a sense not only save the planet but also save a livable future for future generations, which is, I think, the ultimate goal for all of our work. So yeah, thank you. I think just to add into that, a little bit of ideas for the people that might be listening to us. Good places to start are also raising awareness. Communication, social media is very important. If you're starting an NGO or a group, it's just connecting to what was just said. Building capacities is the first step. Just letting people know, letting your friends know, and letting the follower base know what other solutions are in the table, and bringing these topics into the table of discussion is so important and so key as a first step. Second of all, I think that reaching proactively and reaching government officials and decision makers in a way that is constructive and in a way that is informative is always helpful. I think that we all as a youth have a role to, especially for these solutions that are, the most up-to-date technologies, etc., to surface and to present them, and also to foster opportunities for discussion. That leads me to the third idea here for everyone who might be thinking where else to take this. I think that discussion is important. It's important to not stigmatize potential solutions. It's important to not stigmatize research. I cannot emphasize that enough. I believe that everyone has a right to their own opinion, and of course a right to prefer solutions over others, but to limit or to disengage on research is very, very dangerous, because it might leave us in a place where we might be in a worse scenario or a worse situation than where we are right now, but we will not have the knowledge to engage in a way that reduce risks. So those are just some ideas of where we can take this further. Now, I wanted to give the floor back to Maddie, who will give us a little bit of more insights of what have been other successful youth engagement opportunities through GYLI, through the Global Youth Leadership Initiative. And with that, I also wanted to thank here our panelists all the way from Finland for showcasing your work, and really just an invitation to all of our participants here to get to know them, to follow them on social media. Operatio Arctis, they are wonderful young leaders, and I'm sure that we'll be seeing them at the global stage in the near future. So thank you, and back to you, Maddie.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thank you, Operatio Arctis, and for your fantastic work. You are an inspiring example to other young people here at the summit and beyond. And with that, I want to very, very briefly show you 3 slides that show just a few examples of other amazing work that's going on around the world to try and engage youth on climate intervention. So, for example, there was an event that got, so yeah, these are things that GYLI helped to enable. So there was a watch party during Earth Night last year. Josh mentioned it earlier during the summit, where Kelvin featured. They showed a documentary episode that covered climate intervention, and then had a panel discussion afterwards. So there was that, a nice informal way of engaging young people on the topic. There was a panel discussion at the National Youth Conference on Climate Change in Nepal last year, I believe in October. It was in October. Also discussing climate intervention with the Nepalese context among youth. You can see the attendees on the left-hand side there in the picture. Next slide, please. And also Irfan, one of our panelists today, an international strategy fellow at SilverLining as well. He, with Sustainability Week Pakistan, he helped to organize an event, which he did mention also earlier in the summit at Bakhakan University. These are the 3 different newspapers covered the event. So there was there was a lot of local interest as well there. So yeah, just some examples of what's been going on. So yeah, thank you. With that, I will come to the closing of the day. I want to bring back our original word cloud, just to see where we were at before the summit began. So we had things like, urgent and crucial were big things that popped into our head. We had dream, act now, impossible, global responsibility, rapid response. But then we also had possible. So yeah, just keep this in mind. And we're going to do a final word cloud now. Just to compare, think about our responses before and what we were thinking before with keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. After learning more about solar climate interventions, how do we now feel about that phrase? Do we have any different ideas coming to mind, whether that's an emotion, a feeling, an idea, an action, an ambition, a specific stakeholder, that kind of stuff? So please go ahead and submit your ideas. I will also do the same. So we've got some, okay, nice. I'm liking these. We've got inspired. Yes, we like this. Worldwide collaboration and knowledge sharing. We need it. Youth agency. Doable. Yes. Engage. Call to action. Absolutely. Still tough. It's true. Climate intervention could be an option to help keep 1.5 degrees alive. Amazing. Okay. So with that, thank you guys so much for joining us today. Please do get in touch because we have a lot coming up. Right. So what's next for GYLI? We have stuff coming up at the SBs, the UNFCCC subsidiary bodies. Watch out for us there. New York Climate Week, COP28, and more. So please do reach out to us. We've got the GYLI email address up at the top there, gyli@silverlining.ngo. On the left-hand side, there's a QR code to go to the GYLI official website. You can scroll down to want to get involved and you can enter your details there. Alternatively, if the QR code isn't working for you, go to silverlining.ngo, that's the website, and you can navigate to the GYLI initiative through the website. Also, you can read the youth call to action, that's the QR code on the right, and through that you can also sign up. I did send a link to the website in the chat earlier, so it should still be there with you. But so that's everything you need for reaching out to us. We are so glad you were able to be here and discuss these incredibly important issues. I feel truly positive and enlightened after hearing what our panelists had to share today. And I like the word cloud poll, whoever submitted hopeful, I also feel the same. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks to the panelists as well. You were fantastic. And we hope to see you guys in the future. So yeah, thank you.